Welcome back. I appreciate your being punctual, very much so. That'll keep us on track. Just meant to tell you this or give you this stat before lunch. As far as attendance today, we have 180 present, plus or minus a few. Online, we've had 165, plus or take a few. And the people joining by webcast have been everywhere from Puerto Rico to Alaska up through Canada and across the U.S., so, well represented. For those of you who are curious, no, we don't know exactly where you are. We just know the general geographic area. We're not into actually eavesdropping on what you're doing. So, but anyway, very much appreciate your participation, remotely or present here. For our keynote address today, it's a pleasure to have Christopher Hart, the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. Before Chris comes up here, I'll go through a bio, tell you a bit about Chris. And by the way, as you know, the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, is a key partner with us in pipeline safety. As you know, the NTSB does investigate failures, whether it's typically pipeline failures, aviation failures, and other modes of transportation. But certainly, we cross paths and work together with the NTSB in the event that their teams launch on a pipeline failure. And we've enjoyed a good working relationship with the NTSB. But with that, as far as a little bit about Chairman Hart. Chairman Hart was sworn as the chairman, or Member Hart was sworn in as the chairman of the NTSB on March 17th of 2015. He was originally sworn in as a member of the board in August 12th, 2009, and designated by the president as vice chairman on August 18th, 2009. In August 2013, President Obama nominated him for a second term as board member, and after Senate confirmation of his nomination, the president on October 2013 designated him for a third term as vice chairman. He served as acting NTSB chairman since April 26, 2014. Chairman Hart joined the board after a long career in transportation safety, including a previous term as a member of the NTSB. Immediately before returning to the board in 2009, Chairman Hart was Deputy Director of Air Traffic Safety Oversight at the Federal Aviation Administration. He was previously the FAA Assistant Administrator for System Safety. He served as a member of the NTSB from 1990 to 1993. After leaving the board, he served as Deputy Administrator for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration before moving to the FAA in 1995. Now, from 1973 until joining the board in 1990, Chairman Hart held a series of legal positions, mostly in the private sector. He holds a law degree from Harvard University and a master's and bachelor's degrees in aerospace engineering from Princeton University. He's a member of the District of Columbia Bar and the Lawyer Pilots Bar Association. And Chairman Hart is a licensed pilot with commercial, multi-engine, and instrument ratings. And Chairman Hart's family has a tradition of accomplishment in the field of transportation. His great-uncle, James Herman Banning, was the first African-American to receive a pilot's license issued by the U.S. government in 1926. And then, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chairman Hart.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Alan, for that very kind introduction. I appreciate that. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. He wants me to be brief, so I'll try not to be too long, but on the other hand, I am an attorney, and an attorney's number one credo is never use one word when two will suffice. But I will try my best nonetheless. It's also, I didn't realize until Alan said it earlier today, that the anniversary of San Bruno, because the way it works with the members, I'm not an investigator, I'm one of the members of the board, and the way it works with the members is we're on call a week at a time every fifth week, and it just happened that San Bruno happened during my week, and that's why I went to San Bruno. And since then, people have been thinking of me as Mr. Pipeline at the NTSB because they saw me all over the San Bruno, and it really was, to see up close and personal the melted houses and the melted cars and the firemen who said they turned the corner and it melted their windshield on their fire truck. It was really quite and experience to behold. So it really, that's why this is all up close and personal to me, and it's a real privilege and an honor for me to be here. So I'm going to talk about the safety study that we recently did because it's been, it's relevant to obviously the proceedings today, but I'm going to go beyond that and talk about how to identify the things that need fixing and also then how to prioritize those things that need fixing, because I'm finding that those are two issues that were actually beyond the scope of the study, but I'm going to talk about them based on the experience I've seen mostly in aviation, which is where my expertise mostly is. But before I do that, I'm just going to give you a quick overview about what the NTSB does, because most of you probably know, but for those of you who may not, as Alan said, we are the investigators of transportation mishaps. So anything that moves, if something goes wrong, Congress wants us to figure out why and then determine the cause and then make recommendations to try to prevent it from happening again. So our primary product is safety recommendations. So we send out recommendations to whoever can fix whatever is necessary, and according to the media would have you think, oh, it's just a recommendation, we don't really have to do this, so people throw it away. But actually more than 80% of the time, people don't throw it away, they actually do it. And that's a real tribute, and why it's an honor and a privilege for me to be here. That's a real tribute to our staff, both our investigative staff that find out what went wrong, and then our analytical staff that take what went wrong and turn that into recommendations on how to fix it. So that's why Barbara Check is an example, John Vorderbruggen, two of our staff. It's so exciting because they do all the work, I get all the credit. What's not to like? So that's why it's an honor for me to be there, because they do such world-class work that people do it more than 80% of the time, even though they don't have to. Another feature of our agency is that we are independent. So we are politically independent in that most political appointees, I and the other 4 members are nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, so we are the politicals, we're the temporary folks on the scene. But most political appointees are discretionary appointees. What that means in the real world is they serve at the pleasure of the President, so if they do something that's politically embarrassing, they're probably gone. And we've seen that happen a few times in the last few years. Congress created us as term employees, so we are term appointees, and we have 5-year term, staggered term, 1 term of each member expires at the end of each calendar year, so that we have staggered terms, and that way a new president can't just do a wholesale replacement of anyone. We have party balance, so only 3 of the 5 can be of the president's party. But most important is, since I'm a term employee, I'm not in a position where when we're investigating some pipeline explosion, the operator can't come to me, or the union or the manufacturer, whoever, can't come to me and say, if your report doesn't ease up on us, I'm going to go to my buddy, the president, and get you kicked out. Well, that doesn't happen because I'm a term appointee. So what that means is, as I say, discretionary appointees, if they do something politically embarrassing, they're probably gone. My term goes to the end of 2017. So if I do something politically embarrassing, I'm just going to be a political embarrassment until the end of 2017. So that's intentional, and that contributes to our independence. The other way we're independent is that in most regulated industries, when something goes wrong, guess who does the investigating? The regulator. So that means, and this is not a slam on PHMSA, but that means typically if the regulator investigates a problem, and there's many times we see links in the chain to that mishap that are related to what the regulator did or did not do. So if something that the regulator did or did not do is links in the chain to that mishap, there's a good likelihood that will not show up in the regulator's investigative report. Whereas if we do it, it will definitely show up in our report. So that's our independence. The political independence is so that we base our conclusions on the evidence and not on the politics, and then the functional independence is because we have no dog in the fight. We have no interest in it. We don't regulate anything. We don't operate anything. We just are completely independent. So that's what the NTSB does, and that's the perspective that I speak from today. So our safety study that I mentioned, we approved it earlier this year. It was about integrity management in gas transmission pipelines in high consequence areas. And we, as a result of that, we made recommendations to the regulator and to lots of others. We don't want to leave anybody out. Everybody deserves a recommendation, so we want to make sure we get them all. So there are quite a few recommendations in that report, and I commend this report to you because it goes into great detail into the whole integrity management issue in gas transmission pipelines. And the reason we did that was because the numbers ain't going the right way. Okay, so the IM implementation was in 2004, and that stopped the upward trend a little bit, but now we're hoping for a downward trend, and we're not seeing a downward trend. So it's the numbers have not gone in the correct direction. That's one of the impetuses for our doing that study on integrity management in gas pipelines. So the study addresses issues in every step of the process, and there are extensive issues, and it goes into great detail, and that's why I commend the report to you, the study to you, if you haven't seen it. So starting with, how do you identify what an HCA is? How do you identify and verify that it's a high consequence area? How do you identify the threats? How do you assess the risk? All the steps. How do you assess the integrity of the places that you found the risk? And so each one of those steps, the report goes into great detail about what some of the issues are that need to be addressed. I think it would be fair to say that 2 points of major emphasis are we need more data, lots more data, and we need more training so people understand what to do with this additional data. And those are kind of 2 major points of emphasis of that report, and we're seeing that big time in most of the accidents that we investigate. We're seeing those issues big time. So in terms of risk modeling, of course, the purpose of it in terms of integrity management is to tell us we've got scarce resources to fix things. This is to tell us where are we going to apply those scarce resources, when are we going to apply those scarce resources. So that's what this is all about, is how do we allocate these resources to reduce risk. So here's the 2 areas that I'm going to go in that are beyond really the scope of the study. One is, how do we identify the most effective interventions? And I'm going to divide that into 2 categories. One is to high consequence events, and I distinguish that from high consequence areas. I'm talking about high consequence events, typically low frequency, high consequence events on one hand versus high frequency, hopefully low consequence events, and how to identify the most effective interventions in those 2 very different scenarios. They're so different, in fact, that the example I often talk about with BP, and not to pick on anybody, but just in terms of when they had the Deepwater Horizon explosion, they were getting an award in the moment for workplace safety, which means they had done really good on the high frequency, low consequence events, but then the plant blew up, which means, oops, process safety and the low frequency, high consequence events, they don't have their hands around that. So that's an example of, there are vast differences between the 2. I think there's a lot of transferability across them, but I find that when I talk to, say, workplace safety audiences, they don't understand the concept of process safety, and conversely, when I talk to process safety audiences, they aren't familiar with the whole workplace safety thing. There's a lot of transferability across the 2. I'm having trouble bridging that gap, but I'm working on it. So for today's purposes, I'm going to talk about the 2 in separate ways. And then second is, once you look at what interventions do you want, you're probably going to have more interventions than you can afford, so you're going to have to do a huge challenge, which is, how do I prioritize and decide which of these is front burner, which of these is back burner? So to go to the low frequency, high consequence events, those are usually where the effects are widespread, long lasting, and very, very costly. And these are situations where even the insiders were surprised. Wow, I've never seen that one before. That one really took me by surprise. Those are the ones that we look at with an exhaustive investigation that can easily take a year or longer. And that we do with extensive collaboration. Our investigation is done with extensive collaboration from all of the parties who are involved in it, because we really can't do it adequately without that collaboration of the parties. On the other hand, if it's high frequency, low consequence events, I'm going to talk about an aviation success story, because these are usually long-standing problems that have stubbornly resisted efforts to improve them, and over the years, and what that means typically is, if they're long-standing, people come, people go, but the problems are still there, that probably means the problems relate to the processes and not to the people, which is why we've been pushing for stop looking at punishment as the solution, because it's not a people problem, it's a process problem, and you're not going to fix a process problem by punishing the people. So it's generally, in the experience that I'm going to talk about in aviation, it's more efficient to address those high-frequency, low-consequence issues as trends, instead of trying to pick an individual event and investigate it deeply. So for that, again, I'm going to talk about collaboration, a voluntary collaborative effort, and the example I'm going to talk about in aviation is called CAST, Commercial Aviation Safety Team. So the importance of collaboration is because the moral of the story is very simple. If you're involved in the problem, you need to be involved in the solution. That's very simple. If you're involved in the problem, you need to be involved in the solution. So 2 key ingredients for that. One is, again, more data. The more the better, and it's got to be quality data. That's one of the things we're seeing, is we're getting the data that's not necessarily the quality that we need for this process, so it's got to be the more the better, and the accuracy is essential. And then the second step is sharing. That's a key part, sharing across the industry. Ultimately, the goal is, if there's a problem at this location in the industry in Maine someplace, then hopefully the people in Kentucky can benefit from what the people in Maine learned without having to have that problem themselves and have to fix it themselves. So hopefully once the industry collaborates and talks to each other about what problems they're seeing, and that's one of the benefits of sessions like this, is having everybody talk to each other and talk about what these problems are, because they'll share that information, especially if you're not competing on safety. And that's where the airlines are so free with sharing information about safety problems and the remedies for those safety problems, because you never see an airline advertisement that says we are the safest airline. They really do not compete on safety. If they competed on safety, we would have a lot of trouble getting them to share information with each other. That's a big problem I have, for example, in healthcare. When I see hospitals competing on safety, and they, Lord knows, they need improvement when they're talking about, from the Institute of Medicine report, estimated somewhere between 44,000 and 98,000 deaths every year in U.S. hospitals due to medical error. 1,000 to 2,000 a week. Wow. Well, if they're competing on safety, then what's the chance of them sharing information about safety problems and safety improvements? Competing on safety, in my view, is contrary to public policy for industries like that and for industries like yours. If you're competing on safety, you're not going to share information, and sharing is crucial for this collaborative effort to work. So with high consequence events, several of them were discussed in the study because we investigated them. And so that's a two-phase process. First is the factual phase, where here's where the collaboration takes place. We need help from all the parties to help us gather all the facts that are pertinent to the investigation. Then when we get to the analysis, that's when the collaboration stops. We do the analysis alone. The only analysis that is really official is ours. We do invite analysis from all the parties. We invite analysis from the public, because the facts, we put them on the website and then make them publicly available. So we say, okay, Joe Public, okay, parties, here are the facts that we have all collected. Given those facts, what analysis would you put to those facts? And so we do learn from that, and we do invite that, but the only official analysis is the one that we do, which, by the way, part of the way Congress created us, that analysis is not usable in court. So we know that we do not get involved in the litigation process, and we know that our report, our analysis, is not admissible in court. And kudos again to Congress for the way they structured us, and the way they structured that fact of it is that our analysis is not admissible in court. With high frequency events, this is where I'm going to talk about the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, which is a voluntary collaborative process. And the context in which that was generated was the airlines were looking at a fatal accident rate that was coming down wonderfully for a whole bunch of years, but it was starting to get stuck on a plateau. And the reason it was coming down were mostly for technological advances. So, for example, the jet engine was so much more reliable than the reciprocating engine that alone caused a quantum drop in the fatal accident rate. Simulators, what a great invention, because now you can put pilots through situations that you'd never want to put them through in a real airplane. So if they ever do see it in a real airplane, then they can say, oh, been there, done that. I know exactly what to do. So simulators were a huge safety improvement. So those were some examples of what brought that accident rate down wonderfully. But then it was starting in the early 90s to get stuck kind of on a plateau. And they were kind of worried. Correction, they were very worried, because the FAA, their regulator, Federal Aviation Administration, was projecting that in 10 or 15 years, the accident rate, the volume of flying is going to double. So simple arithmetic tells you accident rate times double volume means that Joe Public is going to see smoking, burning airplanes on CNN twice as often. And that was a problem, because Joe Public doesn't care, doesn't help to go to Joe Public, hey, the rate's real low, don't worry. Joe Public cares how many events that Joe Public sees, because Joe Public is going flying. And it's not, gee, I'm on airline X and that was airline Y, so not to worry. Quite the contrary, that was German wings crashing in the French Alps, and I'm worried because I'm going flying next week. So this is an industry where anybody's accident is everybody's accident. That's part of the reason they're so big on collaboration. And I would submit that you have a lot of that too, that anybody's accident is everybody's accident. So in these large complex systems that are systems of subsystems that are coupled together, a lot of high tech, a lot of continuing innovation, always learning. It's like in junior high school, once I learned the dance, okay, I learned that dance. Sorry, that dance is gone, you gotta learn the next one. So every time they invent something new, they're back on a learning curve again, and with all this innovation, and that's a positive thing to be sure. So with all this innovation, ongoing evolution, there's a huge learning curve issue associated with so much of what happens in these industries. So when we see safety issues in these complex systems of coupled subsystems, then usually the problem is not because one subsystem didn't work, the problem is usually the interaction between the subsystems. And so that's kind of good news, bad news. The good news is that means the system is sufficiently robust that one thing typically will not hurt anybody or bend any metal. The bad news is, because it's so complicated, it's hard to point to a specific place and say, if you just intervene right there, you'll fix this problem forever. We don't have those kinds of luxuries because the interactions are complex and ever dynamic, ever changing. So within that context, then, what I say is the solution is system think, which means understanding how changing this subsystem will affect all these other subsystems. Or another way to say that is getting what you want without getting what you don't want, without the unintended consequences. So the collaboration was they brought all the parties together to do 4 things: identify what the issues are, prioritize those issues, because I guarantee you that they're going to see more issues than they're going to have resources to address, develop the solutions for the ones that prioritized and made the front burner, and then finally evaluate those solutions to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do and not creating unintended consequences. So taking large quantities of data, applying sophisticated tools and processes with smart people to turn it into useful information to do the 4 things: identify, prioritize, solve, and evaluate. And that's the way this process worked. That's the voluntary collaboration. That's the effort that it generated. And so here's the success story, huge success story. They took that flat stuck rate and they set a goal to that. Let's reduce that by 80% in 10 years. And people said, nah, it's already so low. There's no way you're ever going to do that. Well, guess what? They did more than that. They decreased it by 83% in only 10 years. And they did it because of this system think process fueled by information. There's where the data is so important. Information from the front lines about what's going well and what's not going well every day in everyday operations. And so that was considered an impossible challenge because the rate was already so low, but they did it. Not only that, there was icing on the cake because now they improved not only safety, but they flew in the face of conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is if you improve safety, you're going to hurt productivity. Improve productivity, you're going to hurt safety. They did both. They did both, and that was amazing. So it was not only contrary to conventional wisdom, but that's why this program is so sustainable, because as much as we safety people hate to say it, if a safety improvement program hurts the bottom line, it's probably not sustainable. So it's got to help the bottom line, it's got to help the productivity in order to be sustainable. So this was not only improving safety and reliability and productivity at the same time, but that's what made it sustainable, because it was helping the bottom line. In addition to that, because everybody was at the table to whom unintended consequences might occur as they're talking and bringing safety ideas out to this collaboration, that's why unintended consequences don't occur, because everybody's there to whom they might occur, and they've figured it out. And that's something a regulatory process could never do. When the regulator issues a notice of proposed rulemaking and everybody comments, then A comments and B comments and C comments, then the regulator knows what A and B and C think, but the regulator doesn't know what A thinks or what B and C think. That's what's missing. That's why it's not collaborative when they're doing the rulemaking, but it is in this process when everybody's at the table at the same time, including the regulator. So the unintended consequences were rare, and guess what? This 83% improvement occurred without a single new regulation resulting from this process. So it was already heavily regulated. They didn't need a bigger stick for the regulator. What they needed was to figure out how to work within this complex system of subsystems and make them work together better. So this was a huge, huge win in so many ways: improved safety and productivity, no unintended consequences, no new regulations. Wow, that was exciting. And the regulator played a role in this, and here's what the regulator did to help make this happen. The regulator encouraged and participated in this system think process, but more important, the regulator made it real clear how it's going to protect the information that the people from the front line are providing about what's going on every day. So it's going to protect the information and the people who provide it, because if the people who provide it are not confident that it will be protected, and if they're worried that it'll come back and be used against them, they're not going to provide it. Then you lose your information source. So the regulator very clearly stated, we are not out to punish anybody, we're out to fix things. And so therefore, absent criminal or intentional wrongdoing, and if it's criminal or intentional, I'm first in line to say, yes, punishment is the solution. But if absent criminal or intentional wrongdoing, the regulator said, I will not use this information against anybody who provides it. So that made it clear and increased the confidence of the frontline employees, the frontline workers, who know better than anybody else in the system what's going well and what's not going well, and they probably also have some good ideas about how to make the things that aren't going well work better. So once that information starts to flow from those people on the front line who know what's happening every day and what's working and what's not, that's the fuel for the process. And that's, again, where data and information are so key to this process. So the regulator certainly is there to punish when necessary, but the real goal is not compliance. The real goal is reducing systemic risk. And so getting the regulator to take that pitch, and that's why I'm excited to see that PHMSA is moving in that direction. That's exciting to see them, because the regulators, it's very easy for them when they go to Congress and say, I want more money, and Congress says, why do you want more money? It's very easy for them to say, well, look at how successful our punishment program was. If you give me more money, I can do more punishing. But if they went and said, I'm improving safety, how do they prove that? That's a tough one to show. So I can understand why the regulators have punishment as an important aspect of what they do, because it is an important aspect for criminal or intentional wrongdoing, but for when things are done because when something goes wrong because of inadvertent error, punishment is not the right answer, but that's what the public cries for, and that's what Congress cries for, and that's the challenge of the regulator, is to say, no, punishment is not the answer. The answer is to fix this complex system and make everybody work together better in this complex system. So is this huge success story from aviation transferable to your industry? Well, that was an industry-wide example that I just gave, but there are other examples in aviation that aren't so broad, that are much more micro than industry level, and I would suggest to you that based on the experience that we've seen in aviation, that if you pick a problem that's been troubling you for a long, long time, you've tried this fix, you've tried that fix, it's not working, if you picked your worst burr under the saddle and applied a collaborative improvement process around that burr under the saddle, if that works, then you know you got a successful program. If it works on your worst burr under the saddle, then you know it's a successful program for you. That's what I would suggest that you look at, is not just necessarily industry-wide. If you can do that, that's great, but not very many industries can do that. Not very many industries have that characteristic that anybody's accident is everybody's accident. So to the extent you can do industry-wide, that's great, but even if you can't do it, even if it's much more located to a facility or even a work team, there's a lot of opportunity to take that collaborative approach around your worst problem that you've been trying to fix unsuccessfully for years and apply the collaborative approach. So that's collaboration. That's how working together is so important to this process. Now I'm going to talk about another challenge, which is prioritization. And I'm seeing as people get smarter about identifying problems, then they run into a prioritization challenge, because now we're seeing that as industries change and evolve, that prioritization is based so much on expert judgment and predictions, especially if you're high tech or continually improving as we are in aviation, and as you are, then that means your process is never going to be perfect. So when you start on that process, don't expect perfection, because perfection will not result from it. Not only that, but even if your prioritization process is robust enough to pick the worst events or the most frequent events, and that's up to you, which is your biggest headache, your worst event or your most frequent event, because typically you're going to have to pick one or the other, but it's not going to predict every event. So that means when you keep having events, how do you know if your prioritization process is even working? So that's one of the challenges, is having a good metric to know that your prioritization is working. How do you prove that you prevented something? That's always a challenge. In addition to that, in aviation, we have what's called the accident du jour, which means yesterday's accident is the one that everybody's clamoring for you to go after, as opposed to your long-term strategy that you had to improve the industry in general. But now, so you're going after either your worst events or your most frequent events, but that might not be your most recent event. So that's a challenge, to go uphill against that media and political clamor to go after that most recent event that you had and fix that, because that whipsaws your program all about, and you can't have a long-term strategic plan when you keep having to change it according to yesterday's accident. So that's a big challenge for prioritization. So here's an example. So our investigations don't go deep enough for us to know, did these people not consider this issue at all, or did they consider it, but they had a prioritization structure that said this is not the one that's going to get the highest priority? And we don't know that. So let's give some examples. When NASA responded inadequately to the foam that struck the orbital during launch and resulted in its demise. Okay, was that because they didn't consider that risk at all, or they did consider the risk and they just had other risks that they considered that were more important? We don't know that. How about when Concorde had tires disintegrate, and they'd had tires disintegrate before? Did they not consider that risk? Or was it a risk that they considered, but their prioritization scheme didn't put it at the top? How about Ford and Firestone tires with the rollovers? How about when people wanted to fly airline simulators, but they didn't want to know how to land? And then that report never got to where it was supposed to, and next thing, people are flying into buildings on 9/11, and then it comes out, well, here's these people that were paying cash to fly these simulators, and they wanted to know how to fly, but they didn't care about how to land. So, in that moment, was that considered a serious problem? No, and the reason it wasn't is because it didn't have hindsight. So when you put hindsight to these, that puts a whole different flavor on everything that is done, and that's one of the things we have to be conscientious about as the NTSB, because everything we look at, we have the benefit of hindsight, because we've seen what obviously didn't work and what went wrong. So we have to keep that in mind, that people have other risks and other challenges, and maybe they were looking at other things. Maybe it's not just that they weren't aware of this one. Maybe they were aware of it, but they just didn't prioritize it at the top for whatever reason in their prioritization process. We generally don't know the answer to that question. So that's one of the challenges regarding prioritization. So here's some examples of statements that are true but not very helpful. Wow, look how much less it would have cost if we had addressed this hazard before it caused a mishap. Or a variation on that theme is, if you think managing the risk is expensive, wait until you see how much it'll cost to have a mishap. But those statements are typically made with the benefit of hindsight. The question is, how do you do that without hindsight? The reason that there's a problem is because you're going to identify more risk than you have resources to address. So you're going to look at potential problem number 1 and how much does that cost, and problem number 2 and problem number 3 and so forth and so on, all the way to the end of the list of your problems. And guess how much that's going to cost? A lot more than you got. So that's why prioritization is so crucial. So how do you decide which one to fix first without the benefit of hindsight? That's the challenge of prioritization. So here are several factors to consider. Some of these are obvious. This is the usual two-dimensional matrix, severity and likelihood, but it's got to be not only past and present, but also with a look into the future in these evolving industries. You also need to look at how much does it cost to fix it. So if it only costs this much to fix it, then you probably ought to just fix it anyway and not worry about the rest of the stuff because it's so cheap to fix. So that's one of the considerations. How about synergies? How about synergies of this issue with other issues? How about synergies of the remedy to this issue with the remedies to other issues? There's some synergistic issues that need to be considered. And how about what other factors might be important in the prioritization issue? That's a challenge. And not only that, but let's look at a process question. Do we take the first issue that we're concerned about and go through and fix that one and send that out the pipeline? So is it first in, first out, or do we look at the totality of issues and then try to see how we're going to handle this totality of issues? So there are lots of issues associated with how to prioritize the numerous remedies you see for problems that you need to fix sooner or later. And then let's look into the future. As IT advances enable us to collect even more information, then the industry is getting better at spotting precursors of things that could go wrong, which means now they know of more things that could go wrong than they already knew before. So what that means is, meanwhile, the risk management resources are probably not increasing. So that means you're going to have the difficulty of prioritizing some mishaps that haven't happened yet over mishaps that have happened. Now that's a challenge. So here's a pictorial statement of that one. Historically, most of the improvements that we generated came from actual problems that really occurred, as opposed to things that we thought might occur. In the future, not only is the pie going to get bigger because we're getting smarter about identifying precursors as we take advantage of these IT advances to identify precursors better, but a larger percentage of those precursors is going to be things that haven't gone wrong yet versus things that already have. That's going to be a real challenge. How do you prioritize something that hasn't messed up yet over something that has? Am I discouraging anyone yet? I hope not. So here's prioritization process has to have all these characteristics in order to really work. It has to be robust, objective, so that if Alan applies it and I apply it, we come up with pretty much the same thing. Repeatable, sustainable, affordable, understandable. Lots of characteristics to the prioritization process. This is one reason why I am encouraged by all the collaboration I'm seeing in this industry, because as you guys are struggling with the prioritization issues like these, and you share with each other how you're addressing these prioritization issues, everybody wins because now everybody's learning from the mass learning capability, if you will. So that's what's exciting about as much collaboration as we're seeing, that PHMSA is bringing people together, and really what this means is we all got to work together. This isn't PHMSA against the industry. This isn't us against the industry. This isn't us against PHMSA. This is all of us working together with our eyes on the same prize of improving safety and working collaboratively to achieve a common goal to address these significant challenges. So those are two issues I wanted to talk about that sort of next steps beyond the study that we did. And with that, Alan, if I have any more time, I'd be happy to take any questions you have. So thanks again for inviting me.
We have a few minutes for a couple of questions. Yes, we have one over here, Christina Sames. Actually, that's your job to introduce yourselves.
Christina, I know where you live, so be careful with your question.
Thank you, Jim. Chairman Hart, I always appreciate your presentations. I love your take on the role of enforcement and collaboration. I also know that your organization has the opportunity to not only look at all of the transportation incidents in the U.S., but are invited, in many cases, to investigate incidents overseas. Based on that fabulous knowledge, what are you seeing that we should be looking at?
That's a good question, and one of the issues that we're having in the U.S. is that we are such a litigious society that the whole concept of sharing information is a much more uphill battle in the U.S. than it is in a lot of places that we go to, where they share much more frequently, much more freely between the regulator and the regulated, between everybody who's involved, between the various entities that, as in aviation, aren't competing against each other, but still because of the litigious nature. Because one of the things that I have found is that if I'm involved in a working out a solution, and the people that I'm working with are potential co-defendants in a lawsuit once the lawsuit happens. So, I mean, in our industry, in aviation, if there's a crash, then you know that the airline is going to be a defendant, the manufacturer is going to be a defendant. So as they're beating up on each other in court, trying to say it was your fault, how effectively are we going to get them to be able to come together and collaborate in this collaborative effort, which is what we really need to improve safety. So one of the differences that we've seen is that we are so litigious in the U.S. I mean, some of my best friends are lawyers, so don't misunderstand me, but we are so litigious in this country that actually undermines the freedom of sharing of information amongst the various participants that have to work together to make this work.
Anyone else?
Either I covered it really completely, or you guys are all tired after lunch, whichever. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to working with you to address these challenges that we all have, and working with you together and collaboratively. Thank you, Alan, for having me.
Thanks, Chairman Hart. Very much appreciate those remarks. And like we said, I think that's one of the reasons we're here, to collaborate and to work together to solve some key issues that we have. I think that does work best.